Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. The mid-month leak was obviously true. Spider-Man got his T4, and since he is a fan favorite, I tried to get all my testing in as soon as I could to bring you the video as quickly as possible. Like all the other T4 testing videos, I'm going to be breaking down the uniform and the level 80 and T4 performance both in PvE and PvP. And I actually even compare one of the older uniforms, the black suit from the previous movie, just to give you an idea whether this new uniform is better in PvE, since it does have the iframe ignore, whereas previously they split the uniforms so that one was better for PvP and the other for PvE. Because I already had the character fully built, that means with an artifact and even some Odins, and level 70 T3, I took him straight into a stage 9 of Knull with no leadership and support as always, and no damage proc. With that setup, I completed the stage surprisingly quick with almost 3 minutes remaining, or in about 2 minutes. This is already a good indicator that the uniform is good for PvE, even without having to take the character to level 80 or do the T4 progression. However, I found that once I took the character to stage 24 with no leadership and supports, he did end up struggling, and that's mostly because he is missing ignore dodge in his kit. He mainly just gets it from his ultimate, but that is on a limited uptime because of the cooldown and time it takes to charge up the ultimate. Just for kicks and to see his comparison when at level 80, I also took Spider-Man into a stage 40 of Knull, this time adding in leadership and support. And surprisingly enough, with White Fox's support, which applies to leadership tagged characters, which Spider-Man is, it gave him chain hit damage and the more important ignore dodge, which actually allowed him to clear the stage with about 20 seconds remaining. Although the character didn't seem to do that well in higher stages because of the lack of that ignore dodge, if you are able to make it up with supports, then the character does fare pretty well. If you're curious to know what the differences are between the two previous uniforms and the new one, the main difference on the third skill is that it now provides a 50% damage increase buff, and the damage accumulation has been moved over to the fourth skill, which no longer has to be charged up by letting the animation play fully. You get the full amount right away, which is the exact same as it was before. The fourth skill also got some tweaks itself, gaining an additional 10% healing, going from 20% to 30%, but it also lost the iframe ignore buff, meaning that the skill itself was an iframe ignore, but with the buff for the next 5 seconds, any skill that followed would also be an iframe ignore. That no longer occurs, but the trade-off is that the damage accumulation being on the iframe ignore skill now makes the skill basically one-shot anyone, and the cooldown is a little bit longer as a result too. The final notable change on the fifth skill is that it no longer provides 20 barrier shields and instead provides 5 seconds of invincible, but on top of that they also added a 30% damage increase frenzy buff, meaning that the skill hits a lot harder. On top of that, because the skill cooldown was around 18 seconds before, to make that awkward kind of rotation less awkward, they lowered the cooldown down to 15 seconds. The fourth and fifth skill got pretty significant improvements for PvP, being able to, as I said, one-shot opponents, and you also now have better protection with that invincible instead of the 20 barriers. But the damage improvement in PvE is also pretty notable, since you can see how it compares to the previous black suit, which was specifically for PvE. With the new uniform, I was able to get to the 12 health bar mark with about 1 minute and 40 seconds remaining, and with the previous PvE suit, the black suit, it actually took 1 minute longer to reach the same health bar mark. So you can see that the new uniform clearly surpasses the old PvE one, even though it also does have the iframe ignore and it lacks the synergy effect that the PvE suit had. Even though Spider-Man's kit is better suited for PvP, if you do want to build him specifically for PvE, because he is maybe your favorite character or you just don't really care about PvP, then the build that I would recommend for him would very likely be a CTP of Rage. Although the character doesn't have guaranteed crit, he also doesn't really have too many skills that can be instant cancelled and layered on top of one another, so you can't really utilize things like a CTP of Energy or a Destruction too well. In fact, his 6th skill is the only one that you can instant cancel. The 4th skill you have to kind of delay cancel to get the most damage out of it, and the other skills you basically want to cycle one by one. With the level 80 upgrade, Spider-Man was able to complete stage 40 of Knull 2 minutes faster, and then taking him to the highest stage of Knull that I could, stage 49, he was able to complete that with about 1 minute and 40 seconds remaining. Moving over to Mephisto and going about 5 stages higher, I was able to complete that in almost exactly the same amount of time, just a little bit slower, but because he has the type advantage, it almost came out to the same result. Versus stage 40 of Gorr, I actually wasn't able to complete this fight, but did end up getting to the last 6 health bars before time ran out. If you want to get an idea of how that compares to the most recent T4, Shadow Shell, she actually couldn't complete the first phase of Gorr at all, so Spider-Man seems to be better in that regard for PvE. However, you also have to keep in mind that I was able to use Fox's support for Spider-Man, whereas Shadow Shell doesn't have the leadership tag, so I couldn't benefit from her awesome passive for her. I also tried to see how he would compare in a stage 25 of Jean. However, that seemed to be way too higher stage to be able to do with no damage proc, and I only got down to the last 20 health bars before time ran out. I don't necessarily think it's because Jean is that much stronger or that Spider-Man is that much weaker, but more so that you need more burst damage in order to do damage when she isn't in her kind of attacking phases and where you have to dodge attacks. Otherwise, you end up losing a lot of time and also waiting for her to go through her different phases. Unfortunately, his T4 skill isn't really anything too special. He basically just gets an attack increase and a web effect that activates when the striker skill is used. But besides that, his stat bump seems to be below par, I would say, or maybe possibly bugged, because his physical damage only increases by around 4,000 to 5,000, which doesn't really seem right. I don't know if this is a visual bug or a bug altogether, since his energy attack improves more than his physical attack, which again doesn't really seem right since he deals physical damage, and for all characters when they get increased to T3 and T4, their main damage type is the one that increases the most. His HP also increases by a minor amount, being close to or around 10,000, which is a little bit odd even for a speed type, since characters like Shadow Shell, for example, had their health increased by 30,000, and Spider-Man is having his HP increased by 1/3 of that. I'm not sure if this is done for balancing or if it's a bug, I couldn't really tell you, but despite that, the character is fairly strong in PvP, as you'll see in the later clips. In terms of the striker to use, if you're going to utilize the character for PvP, which is what I would recommend, then Hulk or Black Widow with their latest uniforms provide a really good striker effect, since they both have iframe ignore and a self damage increase to that skill. So if you survive to the T4 skill, then these strikers will give you an extra iframe ignore skill that activates. With a T4 skill unlocked, I was able to improve my clear time versus Knull by about 40 seconds. Because the clear time was so close before, the improvement was pretty much the same versus Mephisto, being about 40 seconds as well. Versus Gorr, I was able to reach that 6 health bar mark about 1 minute and 20 seconds faster, and then actually complete the stage fully with about 40 seconds left. Again, for comparison, I wasn't able to complete this with Shadow Shell with no damage proc at T4, and was left with 8 health bars left on the last phase. There wasn't really much difference versus Jean. I was able to do about 5 additional bars of health before time ran out, but again, you kind of need a damage proc for her because a lot of her kind of attack phases and just general phases are a lot of time wasting, so you need to be able to do a lot of damage in those short periods of time in order to actually complete the fight, which you can't really do without a damage proc. I actually forgot to test the character versus Dormammu at level 70 and 80. However, he was able to complete the fight at T4, obviously, but he didn't really complete it as quickly as I thought. I think one of the reasons for that is because the second phase of Dormammu is more dependent on the instinct damage that you deal, and unfortunately, Spider-Man's artifact is one that provides an additional defensive layer or dodge as opposed to an offensive one, which is one of the reasons why he didn't really do so well in the second phase, and his overall clear time was around 6 minutes total, or with about 4 minutes remaining. In terms of his skill rotation, the one that I tried out was to quick cancel the first and second skill to charge up the ultimate faster. Then you do the third skill, which will give you the damage buff, followed by the fourth skill, which you delay cancel the second time he jumps in the air. If you cancel it before that, you'll miss out on a lot of damage. And then you finish with the fifth skill, since that has the self damage buff to increase the attack by 100% for that skill. When you have access to your ultimate skill, you basically want to quick cancel it before you start your rotation so that you can fill up the ultimate faster again, but also because it will charge up the damage accumulation from the fourth skill. Once you get your T4 skill unlocked, you basically want to weave that in whenever it's available. In Alliance Battle Extreme, I was able to score almost 10 million with the character. However, I don't really think too many people will use him there because he doesn't really have too many of the cancel effects. He only really has silence, and he's only really usable on the speed hero restriction, whereas a character like Shadow Shell can also be used for the speed hero female days. With that said, with no damage proc, Spider-Man did end up scoring the same amount as Shadow Shell with a mighty CTP of destruction, so I'm pretty sure that he should be able to perform a bit better than her and even cap out in Alliance Battle Extreme. In Alliance Battle Legend, I couldn't really tell you because I haven't had a chance to test him there. The restriction hasn't rolled around for me to be able to try him there, but because of his performance in Alliance Battle Extreme, I would guess that he would also perform better in Alliance Battle Legend too. If you aren't really impressed with Spider-Man's performance in PvE or don't really care as much, his performance in PvP got a pretty drastic improvement with the new uniform. The character was previously timeline meta for a long time, and it basically took a native tier 3 with a lot of iframe ignore and super guard break penetration to push him out of the meta, as well as the addition of a T4 character like Hulk. The main reason that he fell out of the timeline meta was because his fourth skill was a very slow animation. Although it was a full iframe, many of the characters that could counter him could now burst him down fairly quickly before he could even finish the skill and be able to take out the opponent. On top of that, the fourth skill wouldn't necessarily even kill the opponent. It would usually be the follow-up fifth skill, which had the 100% additional damage. However, with the new uniform, as you can see from these clips, the fourth skill alone not only has a much quicker animation, but it can basically one-shot you instantly because it also has the damage accumulation and the additional damage increase bundled in with that skill. As I mentioned previously, the skill has a longer cooldown and also lost the iframe ignore buff that could be applied to other skills, allowing those skills to iframe ignore, but that hardly matters if the fourth skill instantly one-shots the opponent. The other difference of the skill is that it no longer is a full iframe, it's actually a partial iframe now, but again, that hardly makes a difference because the opponent can't do damage if they're dead. Sometimes the longer cooldown on the fourth skill can leave you a little bit vulnerable. However, the fifth skill now also provides you with 5 seconds of invincibility as opposed to just the barrier, so it kind of gives you a little bit of extra protection in that way. The fifth skill also isn't an iframe or partial iframe anymore. It's actually not an iframe at all, but that's kind of the trade-off you get for getting 5 seconds of invincible instead. Luckily, the AI prioritizes the fourth skill first, which for the most part is almost always a one-shot because of that damage accumulation increase, and then follows up with the fifth skill, giving you that additional damage buff as well as the invincible. From there, it just cycles between the 4 and 5, which is really all Spider-Man needs to be able to dominate a timeline team. As you notice from the clips at level 70, the only real characters that provide a challenge to Spider-Man are characters like Jean Grey, who can just iframe ignore right away with the second skill and then lock him down with the super guard break penetration from the fifth skill. Gorr can potentially also take him down, but usually has to get kind of lucky with just locking him down. And then Hulk is pretty much his hardest counter, since all he needs to do is activate the fourth skill to one-shot him. At T4, the character becomes significantly more annoying and a bigger challenge, because not only does he deal more damage, he also becomes harder to hit because of that higher dodge penalty to level 70 characters. But besides that, if you have his artifact, that instinct buff to that artifact will also increase the additional dodge layer outside of the traditional dodge, making the character even harder to hit. I believe that with a 6-star artifact and the character at T4, you can basically get up to 40% additional dodge outside of the 75% that is capped. That is basically calculated to avoid damage coming from the opponent. Because the character can basically already one-shot with the 4th skill already, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a CTP of Greed on him or a Destruction, and would probably advise with either a CTP of Regen or an Authority. Because the character doesn't really have damage mitigation built into his kit, and also now has 5 seconds of Invincible on his 5th skill, I would probably recommend a CTP of Regen before an Authority, because it just synergizes better with his kit. He has 30% healing on his 4th skill that he spams with that iframe ignore, and he also has, I believe, 30% additional recovery or healing when he gets under 50% health. That also applies every 20 seconds when that activates. In terms of the top proc, I would recommend the penetration, since you want to knock the opponent out of their skills as frequently as possible to keep you alive long enough to activate the 4th skill as much as possible and wipe out the entire team. You saw that Jean and Hulk are basically Spider-Man's biggest counters, so if you play the character manually, you can easily deal with these characters just by running around and kind of avoiding their initial burst attack, and simply just using the 4th skill to instantly one-shot them. Because the character is likely going to dominate the timeline meta, it's likely more important for me to show you how to counter the character. And just like many characters that can one-shot you with a skill very quickly, the easiest way to deal with it is to swap characters and get that little bit of 1 to half second of invulnerability or invincibility, and then swap to a character that can basically iframe ignore and one-shot the character in return. As you can obviously see from this clip, Spider-Man is a viable counter to himself. Besides that, you have characters like Carnage who have the iframe ignore counter skill on the 3rd skill, and you have to hope that that doesn't miss, but if it doesn't, you should be able to one-shot him. Hulk is likely his hardest counter because you only really have to use the 4th skill and it will one-shot him 99.9% of the time. However, Jean is still likely the safest counter since you have 2 lives, and if you mess up the first time, you can do the 5 cancel 2 to one-shot him the second time around. That pretty much does it for the testing. I didn't really have much time to do the Alliance Battle Legend one since I didn't have access to it, and I haven't really had a chance to try him out in Alliance Conquest, though I suspect that he will basically one-shot the whole team, similar to how Hulk, Warlock, or Jean does with their one-shot skills. The character is clearly going to dominate the timeline meta, as he's already starting to do in Challenger for me, and it does kind of depend on the restriction of which characters are available. However, most times he is a safe pick because he is so strong at being able to take out opponents so quickly. He's also going to be at the top of the Alliance Conquest meta, and will likely also be near the top for the Alliance Tournament meta, depending on which characters are restricted for that particular week. I'd say that the character is a really strong addition for PvP, so if you are into that, then I would highly recommend the uniform. However, for PvE, he doesn't give you as much value due to restrictions and other characters being available. However, he is still strong there depending on your build and the supports that you use with him. Just as a final note, because I forgot to mention before, the CTP that I was using during the PvP testing was a brilliant regen, so you have to take the results of that footage with a little bit of a grain of salt, since I had a pretty high class build for that testing. Next characters that I'll take a look at are the uniforms for Arachnite and Scarlet Spider, which aren't even close to as good as Spider-Man's newest uniform, but regardless, that is the next video. However, if you did enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing and possibly sharing it with others, since it really helps my channel grow and will probably also help out the people watching. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these, so thank you, but the video is now over.